Thank you very much, Ben. I feel quite intimidated considering the number of professors and so on that have gone before. And I have to preface my remarks by saying these are my personal remarks. These are not necessarily the remarks of CARE, as this is not one of their subject areas, but as also President of the Christian Political Foundation for Europe, you'll see our banner at the back, one of the sponsors of this conference, I have to be able to think right across the field in terms of policy issues. Well, we heard this morning of a papal injunction that we should create chaos. So I'm going to start by questioning the premises of the title that I've been given. But some of what I was going to say was already said this morning by Catherine Veerling. This expression of eliminating poverty. In view of what our Lord said, that we will have the poor always with us, I'm not sure how that can be a realistic objective for Christians to work for together. Having said that, though, I do recognise the theology that was referred to by one of the other speakers this morning from Vatican II and so on about the importance of preference for the poor and the fact that we will be judged on what we do for the poor and needy. So alleviating poverty, which I think was the expression we had later on, is the one I would want to go for. Also, having in the title, how can all Christians work together on this topic, to me presupposes that we're not doing that already. And certainly there are many projects on the length and breadth of this continent apart from the wider world where Christians are working together. Acton Institute is only just one example. In central Athens at the moment, the Orthodox, the Catholic, the Anglican, the Protestant churches are together feeding hundreds of thousands of people every day because of the current economic problems of that country. When this project was started, the overwhelming majority of those who received the charitable benefit were undocumented migrants, to use one of the euphemisms we have for people that are not properly regarded as people, frankly, in our society. But now the vast majority of those needing aid are actually Greek citizens. But I won't go on that subject, but that is a case where the churches are working together, where Christians are working together. In my own country of origin, in the United Kingdom, we have an extensive network of what are called food banks, where people charitably give food to be given out to those who are in need. And they are seeing a level of demand they haven't seen for a long time. Christians working together on the issue of poverty. But we have to be frank, feeding people is a very good charitable initiative. It is following our Lord's injunction in Scripture, but it is not eliminating poverty. If we look at it from a medical perspective, this is symptom control. It's not prevention, it's not cure, it's just symptom control. What we need to work together on as Christians is ways to prevent people ending up in poverty in the first place, and ways to provide a means of escape from a condition of poverty, that they're not locked into it for their lifetime. And I'm just going to go through a series of factors which to me are critical factors in whether or not poverty is endemic in a country or in a region. And a lot was said about family this morning, so I won't be going on to that again this afternoon. You may think this is a random list, and it's not necessarily in order of importance. But the first thing I would start with in terms of world poverty is conflict. Conflict inevitably creates poverty. And we can all think of the war at the moment in Syria and how many millions have had to flee that country and ended up in refugee camps. Nearer to home, in our neighbourhood, the conflict that's been going on in Ukraine for only a few weeks has already made 100,000 people, displaced them from their homes. 100,000 people who no longer have a home of their own, their possessions, a job. They're catapulted into poverty. So if and when Christians can work together to prevent conflict, that is a very significant contribution to reducing poverty. I was in the Council of Europe earlier this week for their Parliamentary Assembly. We had a solemn session on Tuesday commemorating 100 years since the outbreak of the First World War. And a lot of you will remember that in that conflict, both sides were confident they had God on their side and had the support of the churches in their countries for that conflict being a just cause. Is there some way that we as Christians can work together more effectively against conflict and against the justification of conflict? Now, I know there is just war theory, and I know there are situations where people have to defend themselves. But the more we can reduce conflict, the more we will help to alleviate poverty. Corruption, or lack of rule of law, as it's been referred to just a moment ago, is also a very great contributor to poverty. Where there is no predictability about whether you will be able to keep what you've invested in, about whether you will have a fair price for what you sell, in short, where a system depends on who you know or who you're related to or who you've given a bribe to, rather than fair dealings under law, then inevitably you cannot escape from poverty. You are locked in the position in which you started. Qualifications, education. I'm constantly struck by the difference in approach to education from those in countries where it is a rarity of value and those in countries where there is universal provision. There is this hunger for education in what was referred to earlier as the Third World, in Africa in particular. This hunger for education because it is seen as the passport out of poverty, to get yourself an education and to get yourself qualifications. And yet we have situations in parts of Europe where education is disdained and is not benefited from, and we have people leaving school who have no qualifications at all. I personally was quite sympathetic with the proposal that came from the opposition in the United Kingdom last week, that those who leave school without qualifications should not be entitled to unemployment pay, to benefits, unless they agreed to undertake training. So they got some sort of qualification that made themselves employable. Now, the church and the churches throughout their history have been there in the field of education and of training. That's something we have been doing and we are doing right, because education can be the passport out of poverty where employment depends, as certainly it does in the West with our advanced technology, on the level of technical competence. I've had 3 points beginning with C, so I'm going to switch into French. Commerce inéquitable, unfair trade. That is another great barrier to the poor being able to lift themselves out of poverty, and poor countries making progress. I was struck by the fact that last month there was a chocolatiers competition in Ghana. The top chocolate chefs, creators of the world, came together to make products which could then be judged. But did you know the chocolate they used to make creations in Ghana was flown in from Paris? Because there was not chocolate of the right standard made in that country where all the cocoa grows. Sometimes under slave labour conditions as well, which have been touched on in an earlier talk. So the added value of this high quality chocolate was going to somebody in Europe, not to somebody in Africa where the chocolate came from. Also part of the unfair terms of trade, if you like, and it's come out in various negotiating rounds at the WTO, is the heavy level of subsidy of agricultural products in the Northern Hemisphere, which means they can undercut local growers in countries in the Third World. One case that struck me very strongly, because somebody came to our church from that country, from Benin in West Africa, was how cotton, one of their staple products, on which a lot of farmers relied, was being wiped out as a product in their country because of subsidies being given to cotton growers in the Northern Hemisphere. Unfair trade terms, and then credit. We've had a lot of talk about credit. If you cannot get credit, you cannot improve your material position. The scriptures have a lot to say about credit. We don't read much in the scriptures, if at all, of money being given. Especially in the Old Testament, it's always money being loaned. If your neighbour asks you for a loan, you're to give it to him. But it is given as a loan. For a start, that recognises his dignity as another human being of equal worth to you. And it gives him the mentality that this is something to use in order to improve your situation so that you don't need a handout in the future. The backstop of divine grace was that after 6 years the loan was written off. But with a very strong injunction that doesn't mean that you stop giving loans just because they might be written off in the near future. Access to credit. This is another area where Christians have started to work together. And not just Christians, the whole area of microfinance is an incredibly valuable, relatively recent phenomenon in terms of lifting people out of poverty. Microfinance, very small loans that can buy somebody a sewing machine or a bicycle or something which they will be able to use in order to improve their economic condition. And it sounds very, very basic, but with a bicycle you can take more produce to a far more distant market in exponential terms than if you've got to hump everything on your back or pay somebody else to hump it on your back. It's only a first rung on the ladder out of poverty. Access to credit, microcredit even, is a great blessing and is a means. But done within the context of the church, it has an added value. I have a missionary friend, and this is going back some years now, who was doing agricultural work in Nigeria. And as part of that, trying to improve the production of farmers and therefore the livelihood of their families, he wanted to introduce a scheme of loans so they could buy equipment or fertilizer. And at the time, the mission authorities were very, very dubious about this. You know, how can we give the money we've been given for mission to give it to farmers who might not pay it back? What are we going to do? He said, no, we have to teach that this is part of stewardship. And we have to put it within a context of church life and of their faith. And he said, we will set a period for repayment. And when the farmers are ready to repay, we will have a service in church to receive their repayment and to give thanks to God that they've been able to pay this back. And of course, there are many schemes also in Africa where the credit is not in the form of money, but in the form of animals. There used to be a slogan about sending a cow to Uganda and this sort of thing, but certainly the giving of a cow or a goat to a poor family does so many things. Sorry, lending, not giving. You lend the cow or the goat. There is produce to support that family, particularly the children, if they get milk. And if it is a she-goat and a cow rather than the other sex, within a reasonably short period of time, you have another animal to repay your loan with. Access to credit. Within a European situation, a lot of you will have heard the controversy in England with the Archbishop of Canterbury, who very publicly took on those who are lending at rates of interest above 1,000% of what are called payday loans, which is a device for those who are too poor to have any creditworthiness to get a conventional loan. They advertise on the TV, you know, just to tide you over until payday, borrow this small sum of money to us. And very soon, with that rate of interest, the amount you owe escalates and you are trapped even further into poverty than you had before. He publicly denounced this, but he said what we're going to do is we're going to compete you out of business. So he has announced that the Anglican Church in England is setting up its own credit union, and every parish church will be able to give short-term loans at a much more reasonable rate of interest than these loan sharks are giving. Conditions of labour are also critical. The free market is one thing, but a free market without boundaries, without regulation, without limits is quite another. There was a lot in the Acton Institute video about the great value of property rights and having limits so that you knew what you were responsible for. Same also, the market needs limits. And somehow we have to accept the state has a right to intervene to prevent people being paid poverty wages. Now, I know I will probably get some feedback on those from those who don't believe in minimum wages, but I thought it would be fair to refer to the scriptures at this point, from James 5, which is not very popular with the better off Christians, I have to say. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming to you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. A fair wage for a fair day's work is something that definitely needs to be obtained. And again, there is a place for Christians to work together on that. These are all issues where there is a direct bearing between things which people would usually label as politics or public life or whatever, and whether or not people are trapped in poverty. We heard a lot this morning, and it was very good to hear it from the Cardinal, on the issue of human trafficking and the initiative that Pope Francis has taken, along with our Archbishop and with other religious leaders. That I would love to see taken as a model for getting into other areas where things that are wrong in societies hold people back and hold people imprisoned in poverty. Whether it's initiatives to reduce conflict or to resolve conflict in a peacemaking and peace-building role. And that's something our Archbishop happens to have a bit of experience from in his previous work in Coventry. We have a special centre in Coventry for the promotion of peace-building because of the legacy of the last World War, where Coventry was a city which was very heavily destroyed by bombing, and very soon after the war it trimmed up with a German city which had had the same fate, and they worked together on reconciliation and send parties out to Palestine and Israel, to Nigeria, to other places to try and mediate in areas of conflict. The causes of poverty, as you'll see from this list, are really quite extensive, but they're summed up in what's been said far more eloquently than I can in that video. To have a safe and attainable route out of poverty, you need the stable background of the rule of law, of a lack of conflict, and of access to education, which can give you qualifications. I've not been keeping an eye on the time. How much more have I got?
Finish your point.
Okay.
This time.
But at the heart of the point I want to make, which has already come through in other speeches, is that with poverty, it is very right that in the extremis and in emergency we give aid and we give handouts. But that is certainly not a cure. It is not even prevention. And it is so disproportionate. The amount of aid that we give to Africa is far less than the amount we're getting back in terms of profit in trading with them. And it's also far less than the amount that is going to Africa in terms of payments given back by Africans who are working in Europe. We hear a lot about the issue of health workers and what is seen as a problem of health workers that are trained in Africa, then leaving Africa and coming to work in Europe. But a friend from Malawi was telling me, with the money that a doctor from Malawi can earn in Europe, if he sends it back home, we can employ 8 doctors back in Malawi. Okay, there again, they could be tempted to Europe. So our immigration policy also has an effect on whether these countries can lift themselves out of poverty. If people who have the skills can come here and can contribute to our economy, but can also send money back home, that may be another more effective route than just giving handouts. The old adage, which I'm sure you've all heard, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, but teach him to fish and you've fed him for a lifetime, is the approach that we need to go for. This is long term. There won't be very short-term results. But if we are serious about priority to the poor, it's not just soup kitchens, it's not just feeding those who are starving, right and proper as that is, and I don't want to undermine it. It means seriously engaging on these political issues and being willing to put the resources of the church behind what we're speaking about. It may be having a credit union loan facility in every parish church. It may be other items on this list that the churches can provide for. In the past, it was the churches that took the initiative in providing education, in healthcare for those who were suffering and so on. In Europe, with the welfare state, I think we have to some degree lost our way. But we could get back there and really be leading a revolution to alleviate but not eradicate poverty. And now I'll take your questions.